I'm Elizabeth at A Literary Princess, and today I am doing my top books of 2022. So I have picked 10 of my favorites to talk about today. There were some runners-up that I do want to briefly mention that also received 4.5 stars from me, but I didn't want to go on and on about too many, but those were Marriage by Susan Ferrier, You'd Be Home Now by Kathleen Glasgow, Little Rabbit by Alyssa Sonsiridej, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, and How to Suppress Women's Writing by Joanna Russ. So those were like my runners-up, but these 10 that I'm going to talk about today were like my real favorites. And I thought about these long and hard. I do not include rereads in my best books of the year. And I have also opted to not include the 3 volumes of Heartstopper by Alice Oseman that I read. It's a graphic novel series. I read the first book in 2021 and it was on my best books that year. And I read the next 3 this in 2022 and they all were 5 stars. I opted not to include them because I knew I was going to love them because I loved the first one. And I don't know, it kind of felt like, it almost felt like including a reread, even though I hadn't read them before. But since I had the first book on the list the prior year, I felt like I didn't really need to include them this year because of course I loved them. Same as if I would love a reread of one of my favorite books. So, these are the 10. We're gonna start at number 10 and then go up to number 1. And I think a lot of these, especially the top 3, are not gonna surprise anybody that's been watching for a while, but I'm gonna talk about them anyway. Sitting at number 10 is The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. This is my new favorite Thomas Hardy book. I've read 3 of his. Tess of the D'Urbervilles previously had that distinction, but I really loved this. This is the story of Grace Melbury, and she has been away at school where she's kind of been educated above her class. And now when she returns home, her childhood sweetheart, Giles Winterbourne, doesn't seem like the appropriate person for her to marry. And she ends up marrying the new doctor in town, Edward Fitzpierce. This is a love, I think it's a pentagon, that there's like 5 different people involved in this love shape. And I just really enjoyed it. I loved the characters. I loved seeing everything unfold. The only problem, the reason it wasn't 5 stars and it's only 4.5 and why it's at number 10 and not higher is because I really didn't like the ending very much. There was one thing that happened that I was just like, stupid. But other than that, I think this is a great classic. So enjoyed it. I can't wait to read more from Hardy. I'm going to be reading Far from the Madding Crowd this year, which I've heard has some similarities to the Woodlanders, so hopefully I will love that as well. Sitting at number 9 is Phoebe Jr. by Margaret Oliphant, one of my favorite authors. This is the last book in her Chronicles of Carlingford series, and it follows Phoebe, who is a young woman who has come to stay in Carlingford with her grandparents, and she is from a family of dissenters, but she becomes friends with the May family, who is becomes friends with the daughter and the son, and they are the children of the pastor for the regular Church of England church in town. So there's a lot about religion and kind of the clash between the dissenters and the Church of England and kind of trying to mend that, which is really interesting. I love how Oliphant brings in issues like politics and religion and money and banks into her books and shows women being involved in kind of smoothing these issues over. It's great. Phoebe is a lot like Lucilla Marchbanks from Miss Marchbanks in that she is incredibly smart. She is really good in society and like managing things, and that's exactly what she does here. And I just really enjoyed this so much. And I'm hoping that I'll get to involve it in my dissertation. For number 8, we are moving away from classics for a moment. This is Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reed. This is a retelling of the fairy tale The Juniper Tree, which is very dark anyway. And this is an even darker retelling. I should actually look at things before I start talking about them so I can remember their people's names. This follows Marlin Chen, who's one of 3 daughters of, is he a wizard? Yes, he is a wizard. One of 3 daughters of a wizard who's very controlling and doesn't really let them leave the house at all. And she ends up falling in love with a dancer. And how do I describe this? I don't entirely know how to describe this. I do have a whole video talking about this as a retelling, so you can go and watch that. It does have spoilers, but it's very dark and very gruesome. If you're familiar with the Juniper Tree fairy tale, you'll know there's cannibalism involved. There is cannibalism involved here. It's just very dark. In some ways, it's very upsetting. It's definitely not for everyone, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was an interesting world that she created. I really liked the characters. There was one, it's a 4.5 star for me because there was one scene of really horrible violence toward an animal, which I don't do well with. But the fact that I even continued on with it after that, because usually I'll be like, nope, put the book down, leave. I've done that before with books. But the fact that I continued on is really a testament to how good this book was. I have seen somebody say that it's sexist recently. It was over on Tumblr, which I thought was really interesting because the book definitely portrays sexism. There are characters in this that are sexist. They live in a very sexist society. But just because a book is portraying a society that involves sexism doesn't mean that the book itself is sexist. And it's really not. It's pretty clear that the characters that are acting that way are not good people. So, I don't know. I just felt the need to bring that up because I saw it on Tumblr the other day. But yeah, loved this. Very good. We're moving on to 2 that I had on Kindle. For number 7, we have The Beth Book by Sarah Grand. This is a New Woman novel following Beth Caldwell from the time she is a young child until she is into adulthood. And she's something else. She is a very precocious child, and she ends up in a marriage that makes her very unhappy. And she then becomes a writer. And so a lot of the second half is her trying to write and get published, and she ends up leaving her husband and trying to make it on her own. The first half of the book is all about, it's actually more than the first half. It's the first 2/3 are her childhood and seeing all these scrapes she gets into, and then how her mother is just kind of exasperated with her because she is not your typical Victorian little girl, and she doesn't act how a young woman should. I really enjoyed this so much. I loved Beth as a character. Probably my favorite character of the year. I'm not entirely sure. I would need to think a bit more about it, but I did like her a lot. I was rooting for her, and it was just so enjoyable. So enjoyable. And then at number 6, we are getting into the 5-star reads now, is The Wicker King by Kay Ancrum. So this I've seen called urban fantasy and a bunch of other things involving fantasy, and I get that, but this is about 2 boys and their codependent friendship. And when one of them starts falling into these hallucinations of a fantasy world, his friend decides he's just gonna lean into it and go along with it for the sake of their relationship. which is obviously not a great idea, but it happens. So we do have this like whole fantasy world that Jack, the friend, is always talking about and that August really becomes engaged in, but it's not real. And I think Ancram really makes it clear that it's not real, but it is, it's emotional. It's very emotional. Their relationship is so toxic, but I loved it. I love toxic relationships. There's another book with a toxic relationship coming up later on this list. And I just really enjoyed it a lot. I feel like I've just said that about everything. Yeah, it is mixed media, which is really interesting and did not work so great on my Kindle. And apparently it does not work at all on the audiobook, because people who have read the audiobook were like, I had no idea there was mixed media in here. But yeah, there's illustrations, there's photographs, there's written out mixtapes for each characters. I just had a hard time seeing it on the Kindle. I really want to get a physical copy of the book so that I can kind of appreciate that more. But this is one that I would definitely happily reread because it was just great. All right, number 5, we are halfway through. This is the only book that is not a novel on here. This is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I read this for my Women, Gender, and Health class. This follows the story of Henrietta Lacks, who's a Black woman in the 50s? Yes, 50s, who had cervical cancer, and she went in for treatment, and they took a sample of her cells, and they found that these cells multiply on their own in a way that nothing ever had before. And so these then started to be used in testing various things. They are some of the most used cells ever in like medical history, and they did not receive permission from Henrietta Lacks to take her cells. They most definitely did not receive permission to start using them for all kinds of things and to start selling them. So lack of consent. Henrietta Lacks died of her cancer, and the family didn't find out until years after. So this is really the intertwined story of Henrietta having cancer and going in for treatment, the afterlife of her cells, and then her family finding out about it and trying to figure out, can we get, like, you're making all this money off of our mother, shouldn't we be getting something here? So it's super fascinating. It's pretty upsetting at times, but I love the way that Skloot weaves in narrative with medical and scientific knowledge, which I know nothing about because I'm an English major, but it felt very accessible. This was actually the first book we read in our class, and I think it was the perfect way to go into it before we got into some of the more technical reading. I just thought this was great. I just said that about every single book. I'm sorry, but highly recommend. All right, at number 4, we've got another classic. This is Belinda by Mariah Edgeworth. Edgeworth was writing at the same time as Jane Austen, and Belinda deals with a lot of the same things that Austen deals with. A young woman who is getting to marriageable age and is spending time in London and trying to, you know, navigate the marriage market and all that. This was so fun. Like, absolute insanity sometimes, okay? There are 2 women who get in a duel in this, okay? And it's great. When was the last time you saw women getting in a duel? Never. I loved Belinda as a main character. So she's kind of, I would say, the bridge between like the very perfect yet emotional female characters that we see in other 18th century novels, and then the protagonists we get with Jane Austen, who are very flawed, and sometimes emotional, but often more practical. So Belinda's not especially flawed. She's fairly, she's pretty perfect, but she's not emotional at all. She's super practical to the point where she comes off as cold to people that know her. And several people in the novel comment on it. They're like, she's cold. And I just love that. Give me my practical heroines. I love it. Thank you. But I highly recommend this if you're a fan of Jane Austen or of Frances Burney. Super enjoyable. Top 3. And like I said, these are not going to be a surprise to anybody that's been watching for a while because I've talked about all of these multiple times. In number 3, and really number 2 and number 3 were pretty tied, and I just kind of picked one to put above the other for the sake of having, you know, an order. Number 3 is The World Cannot Give by Tara Isabella Burton. This is the story of, again, I should be checking the names, Laura Stearns, who goes to this private school and meets the lead soprano of the choir, whose name is Virginia Strauss, and they fall into this very toxic relationship. Again, I love toxic relationships in my fiction, not in my real life. This just really hit all the boxes for me. I don't think this is a novel for everybody, but for me, it was perfect. Private schools, dark academia, toxic kind of codependent relationship between two girls. Like, this was just hitting every single box for me. I loved the character of Virginia. I love how well she's drawn. She's just fascinating. I really want to reread this, and I don't have time to be rereading things. But I had an arc, and I went out and bought my own copy. That was how much I liked this. In hardcover. All right, number 2, back to classics. We have The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I'm writing a paper on this. I actually do need to reread this one, either in January or February, because I'm writing a paper on it. That's how much I loved it. I was like, I'm writing a paper on this. This is the story of, what's his name? Walter Hartwright. He encounters this woman in white on a London road one night and kind of becomes wrapped up in this drama of her and then this family with 2 girls who he is giving drawing lessons to, Laura Fairley and her half-sister Marian Halcombe. This is told from multiple perspectives. So we've got Walter Hartwright's diary, we've got Marian's diary, we have spoken accounts from like the housekeeper and stuff like that, and just trying to solve this mystery of what has happened and what is going on here. And it's so intricate, and I love it. It's great. I'm very happy to be rereading it because I think there's probably a lot of things that I might have missed the first time around, just because there's so much in here with all these different perspectives and everything. Yeah, that's just great. Also, there is a fantastic 2018 miniseries done by BBC. Highly recommend that. I'm going to be rewatching that for my paper as well. Number 1, surprise to nobody, I think, Babel by R.F. Kwong, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce anybody's name. I feel terrible. This is historical fantasy set in the early Victorian period. It's an alternate world where there's magic that is worked through silver and it uses translation. And this follows Robin Swift, who's a young Cantonese boy who gets kind of plucked up by this Oxford professor and brought back to England and trained in translation so that he can go to Oxford's translators, what's it called? the Royal Institute of Translation, which is called Babel, and they have a big, huge tower in the middle of the campus. Obviously a reference to the Bible story. This deals a lot with imperialism and colonization. So we've got Robin, who is Chinese. We have two friends of his in his cohort. One is from India, one is from, I believe, Haiti. And then there's one girl who's English and white. And we see the racism they encounter. We see the sexism the women encounter. Babel is the only school in the university to allow women to come, and they actually do have to dress as boys in order to not cause a ruckus. And just the intricacies of this and how it relates to translation, but also how it relates to academia. There is such great critique of academia in here, and that is why I really loved it. I've heard some people criticize how the characters, we don't really see how close they are. We're just kind of told how close they are. And looking back, I can agree that the characters take the back seat to the issues the book is dealing with. But for me, as somebody in the middle of academia, like smack in a university right now, dealing with a PhD, this critique was so spot on. Which is terrifying because this takes place in the 19th century. But ultimately, things are not very different. It's just gotten subtler. So I loved that she was calling all this out. And I think she has her PhD in translation, I believe. Yeah, so she has an MPhil in Chinese Studies from Cambridge, an MSc in Contemporary Chinese Studies from Oxford, and she's now doing her PhD in East Asian Languages and Literature at Yale. So she's been in academia, she knows what's up, and she is calling them out on their bullshit, and I love it! Yeah, this was my favorite book of the year. Again, I had an arc. I asked for a copy for Christmas because I was like, I need this in my life. And it's just beautiful. And I hope I'll get to reread it sometime soon because I really want to reread it now. And as we all know, I can't. So those were my top 10 books of 2022. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read any of them? What did you think? What were your favorite books of 2022? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.